Hey guys, tonight we drift back into a world where the air smells faintly of coal smoke and damp wool, where gaslight flickers against polished brass, and where you feel, immediately, that you are being watched. You stand on a narrow Victorian street, boots carefully placed so you don't splash mud onto your hem, because even a speck of dirt might quietly ruin you. Respectability here isn't just an idea, it's a full-time job, and you clock in the moment you wake up. You probably won't survive this with your modern habits intact, especially if you enjoy stretching in public or speaking before thinking. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As you settle in, imagine thousands of other listeners easing into bed as well, and feel free to post your location and local time in the comments, because even across centuries, it's nice to know where everyone's listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You exist now in a society obsessed with rules that are rarely written down but always enforced. Victorian social life, especially in Britain during the 19th century, revolves around the concept of respectability, a blend of morality, class awareness, and self-restraint. You don't announce who you are, your behavior does that for you. Historians still argue whether this obsession grew mainly from industrial urban crowding or from religious moral movements, but either way, you feel its weight pressing gently but constantly on your shoulders. You learn quickly that everything is a signal. How you stand, how loudly you laugh, how long you hold someone's messages. All of it sends messages. You're expected to master a kind of social choreography, moving through the day with measured gestures and controlled expressions. Smiling too broadly suggests foolishness. Speaking too freely hints at low breeding. Silence, practiced carefully, becomes a virtue. Think of it as emotional minimalism, Victorian edition. One mainstream historical fact settles in fast show. Social class in Victorian society is rigid but not entirely immovable. Industrialization has created a swelling middle class, and with it anxiety, you might not be born into wealth, but if you behave correctly, dress well, attend church, keep scandal at bay, you can appear respectable. Appearance matters so much that it almost becomes reality. It's the original, fake it till you make it. Except the consequences of failing are far less forgiving. You notice how people constantly measure one another. A neighbor's curtains are slightly shabby. Someone else's accent slips just a bit when they're tired. These details are noted, filed away, and quietly judged. No one confronts anyone directly. That would be rude. Judgment here works more like a fog, soft everywhere and impossible to escape. It's impressive in a deeply unsettling way. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you observe daily life. Victorians often believed that moral character could be read directly from facial features. A broad nose, a heavy brow, or asymmetrical features were sometimes thought to indicate criminal tendencies. Yes, you're being silently evaluated not just for your manners, but for your cheekbones. Suddenly, bad lighting feels like a personal attack. This belief feeds into pseudosciences like physiognomy, which respectable people discuss with alarming seriousness over tea. You feel pressure to regulate your body as much as your behavior. Slouching suggests laziness. Fidgeting implies moral weakness. Even breathing seems to require moderation. You imagine explaining this to a modern yoga instructor and quietly laugh to yourself, your first light joke of the evening. But quickly stifle it, because laughing alone in public would be odd, and odd is dangerous. Public space belongs to rules. On the street, you walk with purpose but not haste. Lingering suggests idleness. Rushing suggests desperation. You grade acquaintances with polite restraint, never burdening them with too much enthusiasm. Emotional containment becomes a survival skill. Historians still argue whether this emotional discipline genuinely reflected inner beliefs or simply functioned as social camouflage. But you don't have the luxury of pondering it too deeply. You just comply. Religion hums in the background of everything. Even if you're not particularly devout, Christian morality shapes social expectations. Sabbath observance, modesty, temperance, these ideals seep into daily routines. One historical fact anchors this firmly: church attendance in Victorian Britain is both a spiritual act and a social performance. People notice who shows up, who doesn't, and how seriously they seem to listen. You sit upright, eyes forward, hoping your face looks sufficiently reflective. You also learn that privacy is limited in strange ways. While Victorians value modesty, they live in close quarters, especially in growing cities like London and Manchester. Thin walls, shared courtyards, and crowded streets mean your life is constantly on display. Respectability becomes armor. You perform it not just for approval, but for protection. A second light joke drifts through your mind. It's like living inside a reality show where the prize is not being talked about. Even leisure carries moral weight. Idle pleasure is suspect unless carefully framed as improving or wholesome. Reading is acceptable if the material is uplifting. Walking is fine if done purposefully. Sitting around doing nothing feels vaguely sinful. You begin to understand why exhaustion seems baked into Victorian life. Resting without justification feels like breaking a rule, even if no one can say which one. Beneath the surface, you sense tension. The rules promise order and stability, but they also generate anxiety. You watch people police themselves relentlessly, afraid of slipping. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly believed in their moral codes or secretly resented them, but you suspect it's both. Humans are good at convincing themselves that what constrains them is also what keeps them safe. As night settles, gas lamps glow softly, and the day's performances wind down. You retreat indoors, posture finally relaxing just a fraction. Even alone, the rules echo in your mind. You straighten objects, lower your voice, control your thoughts. A third light joke floats by. Imagine Victorian social rules it to modern group chats, but you let it fade because tomorrow you'll wake again under the same watchful expectations. And so you drift to sleep inside this carefully ordered world, knowing that from the moment you open your eyes, respectability will once again be waiting, patient and demanding, ready to guide every step you take. Morning arrives without ceremony. You wake before the sun has fully sorted itself out, because sleeping late already feels faintly responsible. The room is cool, the air carrying that familiar blend of coal dust and starch, and as you stretch, carefully, quietly, you remember that even the way you begin your day reflects who you are allowed to be. There is no neutral starting point here. From the first moment you're awake, class settles over you like an invisible garment, tailored before you were born. Your breakfast table tells your story long before you speak. If you belong to the working class, the meal is simple and practical, designed to fuel labor rather than impress anyone. If you're middle class, there's an effort toward refinement, clean crockery, perhaps a newspaper folded just so, tea poured with modest confidence. In wealthier homes, servants glide in and out, and the breakfast itself becomes a quiet demonstration of status. One mainstream historical fact anchors this routine in Victorian Britain. Breakfast habits differed sharply by class, not just in what you ate, but in how and where you ate it. You become aware that language is one of the clearest class markers. Accents matter. Word choice matters. You carefully avoid slang if you're trying to appear respectable, because slipping into the wrong phrasing can undo years of careful presentation. You listen more than you speak, mentally adjusting your vocabulary in real time. It's exhausting, but it's also necessary. People aren't cruel about it, not openly. They just notice. And once they notice, they never forget. A quirky tidbit drifts into your awareness as you observe conversations around your elocution lessons are becoming popular among the aspiring middle class. People literally pay to relearn how to speak, smoothing out regional accents and practicing proper pronunciation. You imagine modern speech coaches trying to raise someone's hometown entirely, and the comparison feels uncomfortably familiar. The goal isn't communication, it's camouflage. And you step outside and the street itself reinforces the hierarchy. Certain neighborhoods feel heavier with expectation. Cleanliness becomes a moral signal. A swept doorstep suggests discipline, while clutter hints at moral failure. Historians still argue whether this moral reading of poverty caused more harm than help, but from where you stand, the judgment feels immediate and personal. Even the way you carry yourself, shoulders back, gaze steady, becomes part of your daily uniform. Work, if you have it, defines your place with ruthless clarity. Manual labor marks your hands, and no amount of good manners can fully erase that. Clerical work offers a different set of constraints, clean cuffs, controlled movements, polite efficiency. A mainstream historical fact grounds this divided. The rise of clerks and office workers in the 19th century creates a new class identity, one built almost entirely on appearance and behavior rather than physical strength. You realize how fragile that identity is. A torn sleeve or a raised voice could knock you right back down the ladder. Women experience these divisions with particular intensity. Class shapes not only what you do, but where you're allowed to be seen. Middle-class respectability often demands that women appear sheltered, protected from the roughness of public life. You notice how carefully outings are planned, how visibility itself is managed. A woman seen too often in public spaces without a clear purpose invites speculation, and speculation is dangerous. It's strange how something as simple as walking becomes a statement. Children absorb class rules almost before they can read. You watch them being corrected gently but constantly. Sit up, speak properly, don't interrupt. Childhood here is less about play and more about rehearsal. Historians still argue whether Victorian childhood was genuinely oppressive or simply structured differently, but either way, you see how early the training begins. By the time children reach adulthood, the rules feel natural, like gravity. There's a constant tension between aspiration and fear. You might hope to rise, to edge closer to comfort or security, but the climb is steep and slippery. One misstep, financial trouble, a public embarrassment, an ill-considered friendship, can undo progress instantly. Respectability isn't something you achieve once, it's something you maintain daily, like a fire that needs constant tending. A second light joke flickers through your mind too. It's like maintaining a social media profile, except the algorithm is your neighbor's. Religion reinforces these distinctions without always naming them. Sermons emphasize hard work, humility, and moral cleanliness, virtues that align neatly with middle-class ideals. You sit in the pew aware of who sits where, how they're dressed, how attentively they listen. One historical fact settles in kill. Church seating in some Victorian parishes is actually rented, meaning even worship space reflects economic status. Salvation might be equal, but legroom is not. Even leisure choices signal class. Reading certain novels, attending lectures, or playing specific games marks you as educated and respectable. Other forms of entertainment, too loud, too physical, too joyful, are frowned upon. You learn to curate your pleasures, selecting pace teams that improve you, or at least appear to. Historians still argue whether Victorians genuinely believed pleasure needed justification, but you can feel the pressure either way. As evening approaches, you return home carrying the quiet weight of these distinctions. You replay conversations in your mind, checking for slips. Did you pronounce that word correctly? Did you laugh too loudly? A third light joke rises. Imagining autocorrect for social behavior, but it fades quickly. Self-surveillance is tiring work. You settle into bed knowing tomorrow will bring the same careful calculations. Class here isn't just a label, it's a script you perform continuously. As sleep draws near, your thoughts slow, and for a brief moment, the rules loosen their grip. In that soft space, you rest. Not as a worker, not as a social type, but simply as a person until morning calls you back into the performance. You dress slowly, not because you want to savor the moment, but because getting it wrong would be unthinkable. Clothing in the Victorian world isn't about comfort or self-expression, it's a language and you're expected to speak it fluently. Every button, every fold of fabric, every carefully chosen color announces who you are, or who you're trying to be, before you ever open your mouth. You can feel the weight of the garments settling onto you, layers upon layers, like a physical reminder of the social rules you carry all day. You learn quickly that there is no such thing as casual dress. Even at home, your appearance matters. A man's collar must be stiff and clean, his jacket properly cut. A woman's dress should be modest structured and appropriate to the time of day. Morning dresses differ from afternoon ones, which differ again from evening wear. One mainstream historical fact grounds this obsession. Victorians followed strict conventions about day dress versus evening dress, and ignoring them marked you as ignorant or improper. You imagine accidentally wearing pajamas to a formal event and wince. It's that level of social error. Fabric choice carries meaning. Wool suggests practicality and respectability. Silk whispers wealth. Lace, when used sparingly, implies refinement. Too much suggests vanity. Dark colors convey seriousness and moral restraint, especially in public. Bright colors aren't forbidden, but they're risky, especially for women who are expected to embody modesty. You glance at yourself and feel oddly relieved when nothing stands out too much. Standing out here is rarely a compliment. A quirky tidbit slips into your awareness as you fasten everything just right. Some Victorians believed that certain colors could influence moral character. Black suggested sobriety and seriousness, while red was associated with passion and danger. This belief wasn't universal, but it lingered in advice manuals and social commentary. Suddenly, choosing an outfit feels like dabbling in amateur psychology. You silently promise yourself not to experiment. Undergarments do much of the real work. Corsets shape women's bodies into the fashionable silhouette, signaling discipline and self-control. For men, stiff collars and structured coats enforce posture and restraint. One historical fact settles in: corsetry is nearly universal among middle and upper-class Victorian women, worn not just for fashion, but as a sign of respectability. The discomfort is real, but so is the expectation. Enduring it quietly becomes a virtue. Complaining would suggest weakness, or worse, moral laxity. You notice how clothing regulates movement. Long skirts limit stride length. Tight sleeves restrict gestures. Even sitting requires care. These garments train you to occupy space modestly, deliberately. Historians still argue whether Victorian fashion was consciously designed to enforce social behavior or whether that effect was incidental, but living inside it, the result feels intentional enough. Your body learns the rules even when your mind resists them. Cleanliness is non-negotiable. A spotless appearance suggests inner order and moral cleanliness. Stains or wrinkles hint at chaos, laziness, or moral failing. This is particularly cruel in crowded industrial cities where dirt is everywhere. You do your best, brushing lint, smoothing creases, knowing that perfection is expected even when it's nearly impossible. A light joke drifts by. Imagine white shirts in a coal-powered city, but you suppress the smile. Humor doesn't iron out social judgment. Accessories matter too. Gloves indicate refinement, bare hands in public can seem improper. Hats are practically mandatory, their style signaling gender, age, and class. Removing a hat at the right moment becomes a tiny ritual of politeness. Forgetting to do so marks you instantly. One mainstream historical fact anchors this: detailed men were expected to remove their hats indoors or when greeting women, a gesture loaded with respect. Your hand hovers near your hat brim, always ready. Fashion magazines and etiquette guides circulate widely, telling you what to wear and how to wear it. You read them carefully, even if you can't afford everything they recommend. Historians still argue whether these publications democratized fashion or simply deepened anxiety, but from your perspective, they feel like rule books written by people who assume you already know the rules. It's comforting and stressful all at once. Children are dressed like miniature adults, their clothing reinforcing discipline early. Starched collars, stiff shoes, carefully arranged hair. Playfulness is secondary to presentation. You watch a child struggle with too tight boots and feel a pang of sympathy. A second light joke surfaces: childhood here looks exhausting. But again, you keep it to yourself. There's very little room for personal taste. Fashion changes, but slowly, and deviation is risky. You might admire something unusual, but wearing it would invite scrutiny. Historians still argue whether Victorians secretly longed for more expressive clothing or genuinely preferred uniformity, but you suspect longing simmers quietly beneath all that starch. As the day wears on, you become acutely aware of how much energy goes into maintaining this appearance. Clothing restricts signals and protects all at once. It shields you from judgment if done correctly, but exposes you mercilessly if done wrong. A third light joke flickers. Modern dress codes suddenly seem merciful, but it fades as you straighten your cuffs once more. When evening comes and you finally undress, there's a subtle sense of relief. The layers come off, and with them, a bit of the day's vigilance. You fold everything carefully because even at rest, respectability expects order. Slipping into bed, you feel lighter, freer, if only for a few hours. Tomorrow you'll dress again, rehearse the language of fabric and form, and step back into a world where clothes speak louder than words. Meals are never just about eating. The moment you sit down at a Victorian table, you understand that food is secondary to performance. Your posture straightens instinctively. Your hands settle where they're supposed to, and your eyes scan the place setting as if it might suddenly test you. Every movement, from lifting a fork to folding a napkin, carries meaning. This is one of those quiet arenas where respectability is constantly measured bite by careful bite. You quickly learn that table manners are a form of social literacy. Using the wrong utensil or reaching across the table signals ignorance. One mainstream historical fact grounds this anxiety. Victorian dinners often involve multiple courses, each with its own specific utensils, and knowing which to use was considered basic breeding. You watch others closely, mirroring their actions, because asking would be worse than guessing wrong. Silence here is safer than curiosity. Conversation is equally regulated. You avoid controversial topics, strong opinions, or anything too personal. Politics might appear at the table, but only in measured tones. Money is discussed obliquely, if at all. Personal hardship is never mentioned. You learn to speak in pleasant generalities, offering observations that don't demand too much agreement or disagreement. A light joke flits through your mind. This feels like a group chat where everyone's afraid to type, but you keep your expression neutral. Even how much you eat is observed. Appetite should be moderate. Eating too little suggests affectation or illness. Eating too much hints at greed or lack of control. You aim for a careful middle ground, stopping before you're fully satisfied. Historians still argue whether Victorians were genuinely restrained eaters or simply good at hiding indulgence. But the performance of moderation is what matters. You place your cutlery down just so, signaling polite completion. Gender shapes dining behavior sharply. Women are expected to eat delicately, taking small bites and avoiding messy foods. Men have slightly more freedom, but even they must avoid anything that looks gluttonous. One historical fact settles, and advice manuals often instructed women never to appear hungry in public. You imagine navigating a long dinner while pretending you're barely interested in food, and the mental image alone makes you tired. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you observe the table where elaborate dining sets weren't just decorative, they were moral tools. Certain foods were served in specific ways to encourage restraint. Soup bowls, for instance, were designed to limit large mouthfuls. Even furniture participates in behavior control. It's impressive in a slightly unsettling way how deeply manners are engineered into everyday objects. Servants, if present, add another layer of complexity. You're careful not to acknowledge them too directly, but also not to ignore them completely. Too much friendliness suggests social confusion. Too much coldness suggests cruelty. There's a narrow, awkward middle path. Historians still argue whether this emotional distance was necessary for household order or simply reinforced inequality. But from your seat at the table, it feels like another rule you didn't write but must follow. Meal timing matters too. Lunch and dinner are served at socially appropriate hours, which shift over the century but remain strict at any given moment. Being late is rude, being early is presumptuous. You arrive precisely on time, heart beating just a little faster as the clock ticks toward the acceptable minute. A second light joke surfaces. Victorians would love calendar alerts, but you swallow it along with a sip of tea. Tea itself is a ritual. Pouring, stirring, and drinking follow their own quiet choreography. Milk or tea first? That question alone can mark your upbringing. One mainstream historical fact anchors this: the order of pouring tea and milk was sometimes associated with class, with milk first often linked to practicality and tea first to refinement, though historians still debate how rigid this distinction truly was. Either way, you choose carefully, hoping no one notices the hesitation. Children at the table are trained early. They sit straight, speak only when spoken to, and learn to navigate utensils sized almost too large for their hands. Mistakes are corrected gently but firmly. You see how manners become muscle memory, ingrained before a child can fully understand why they matter. A third light joke drifts through your mind. Imagine toddlers mastering formal dining, but again, you keep it to yourself. As the meal winds down, you feel a subtle relief. You've made it through without incident. No spills, no awkward silences, no obvious breaches of etiquette. The plates are cleared, conversation softens, and the tension eases slightly. But you know this wasn't just dinner, it was a test, one you'll take again tomorrow. Later, as you prepare for bed, the memory of the table lingers. You replay small moments, checking for errors. Did you hold your fork correctly? Did you speak too much? Too little? This constant self-review is exhausting, but it's also normal here. Manners aren't just about politeness, they're about belonging. You lie down, the day's performance is finally behind you. In the quiet, you imagine eating freely, laughing loudly, not worrying about which spoon to use. The thought is comforting, almost rebellious. Sleep arrives softly, and for a few hours at least, no one is watching how you hold your fork. Social life doesn't happen spontaneously here. It's scheduled, announced, and carefully filtered through paper. You hold a small, stiff rectangle between your fingers, a calling card, and feel its quiet power. This simple object determines who you may visit, when and under what circumstances. Dropping by unannounced is unthinkable. In the Victorian world, even friendship requires an appointment. You learn that calling cards function like social passports. Your name is printed plainly, sometimes with an address, nothing flashy. Too much decoration would seem boastful. One mainstream historical fact anchors this ritual. Exchanging calling cards was a standard practice among middle and upper-class Victorians, governing introductions and visits. You present your card to a servant at the door, who disappears inside to decide whether you'll be received. You wait, heart thumping softly, wondering if your social credentials are sufficient. Timing is everything. Visits are permitted only during specific calling hours, usually in the afternoon. Arriving too early suggests eagerness. Arriving too late suggests poor breeding. You consult the clock obsessively, calculating the exact moment that says, "I am polite, not desperate." A light joke floats by. Victorian socializing feels like landing a plane, but you straighten your gloves and focus. If your card is accepted, you're shown into a carefully arranged sitting room. Chairs are placed just so, creating a polite distance. You sit on the edge of your seat, back straight, hands folded, aware that the visit should be brief. Staying too long is rude. Leaving too quickly suggests disinterest. You aim for that perfect middle length, guided more by instinct than certainty. Historians still argue whether people genuinely enjoyed these visits or merely endured them as social obligations, but from where you sit, endurance feels accurate. Conversation during calls is light and controlled. You avoid personal confessions, strong opinions, or anything that linger uncomfortably after you leave. Topics like weather, recent events, or general health are safe. You speak pleasantly, listen attentively, and watch for cues that it's time to go. A second light joke flickers. This is speed dating without romance, but you keep your face composed. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you observe the ritual more closely. Leaving your card without requesting a visit can signal sympathy, congratulations, or social acknowledgement. Folding a corner or writing a small note adds layers of meaning. It's an entire language of paper and gesture. You imagine trying to explain this to someone used to instant messaging and feel a quiet sense of disbelief at how much effort goes into not saying much at all. Reputation travels through these visits. If someone receives you often, it suggests approval. If your cards go unanswered, the message is clear. One historical fact settles in: social acceptance in Victorian society often depended less on wealth alone and more on being welcomed into the right homes. Doors opening or staying closed shape your entire social world. You begin to understand how isolating exclusion can be. For women, calling is especially significant. Visits help establish respectability, friendship, and potential marriage connections. Being visible in the right circles matters deeply. Too many visits can seem forward, too few can suggest neglect or social failure. You watch women navigate this delicate balance with impressive precision. Historians still argue whether this system empowered women socially or confined them further, but you can see both sides playing out in real time. Men participate too, though often with more freedom. Business relationships overlap with social ones, and a well-timed visit can strengthen professional ties. Even so, rules still apply. Casual familiarity is dangerous. You maintain a polite distance, aware that overstepping could damage more than just a friendship. Servants again act as gatekeepers. Their expressions reveal nothing, but their actions speak volumes. Being invited inside versus turned away is a judgment rendered silently. You're polite always, because today's servant might tomorrow carry word of your behavior elsewhere. A third light joke rises. Networking has always been awkward, but it fades as you thank them quietly. Even endings are scripted. You rise at the appropriate moment, express gratitude, and depart with measured warmth. No lingering in the doorway, no sudden emotional displays. Outside, you exhale softly, the tension easing as you walk away. You replay the visit in your mind, checking for missteps. Did you laugh too loudly? Did you stay too long? As evening falls, you sort through your own stack of cards at home. Each one represents a connection, a possibility, a judgment. You arrange them carefully, almost reverently. Social life here isn't loud or spontaneous, it's quiet, deliberate, and exhausting. When you finally prepare for bed, the day's small interactions blur together. The cards, the visits, the polite smiles, they all form a delicate web that holds your social world in place. You lie down, grateful for the silence, knowing that tomorrow, the paper rituals will begin again. Sleep comes gently, carrying you away from doors that open and close with such quiet authority. Romance, you discover, is handled here with the delicacy of fine china and the tension of a locked door. Courtship exists, certainly, but it unfolds at a glacial pace and under constant supervision. Desire is not denied exactly. It's just wrapped so tightly in rules that it barely recognizes itself. You feel it in glances held a second too long, in letters read in private, in walks that are carefully chaperoned but emotionally charged all the same. Physical contact is almost non-existent. Touching someone's hand by accident can feel electric, shocking, and slightly terrifying. One mainstream historical fact grounds this restraining. Victorian courtship strictly limited physical interaction, especially for unmarried couples, with chaperones often present during visits or outings. You learn to communicate affection through posture, tone, and timing. Leaning in just a little during conversation becomes a bold move. Standing too close might be scandalous. Letters become the safest place for feeling. You write carefully, choosing words that suggest warmth without stating it outright. The paper absorbs emotions that would be inappropriate in person. A letter can be read, hidden, treasured. You imagine the thrill of seeing familiar handwriting and feel your heart lift. Historians still argue whether Victorian letter writing encouraged emotional depth or merely replaced physical intimacy with controlled expression. But either way, the page carries more than ink. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you observe courting couples, and even the length of a walk together can be regulated. Certain paths are considered respectable, others invite gossip. Parks become stages for subtle performances, where everyone pretends not to watch while watching very closely. You stroll at an approved pace, aware of eyes that may or may not be there. A light joke drifts through your mind. This is flirting with GPS restrictions, but you keep your gaze politely forward. Chaperones are constant companions. Mothers, aunts, older siblings. All serve as quiet guardians of reputation. They listen without appearing to listen, watch without staring. Their presence shapes conversation, steering it towards safe topics. You speak about books, weather, or family, never feelings directly. Historians still argue whether chaperoning prevented impropriety or simply pushed it into subtler forms, but from your perspective, it's an ever-present reminder to behave. For women, the stakes are especially high. Reputation is fragile, and a single rumor can be devastating. Being seen alone with a man too often or at the wrong time invites speculation. You sense how carefully women calculate visibility, balancing interest with caution. Men have slightly more freedom, but not much. One historical fact settles in engagements were often expected to follow a clearly defined, respectable courtship, signaling intention and restraint. Ambiguity is risky. Even emotions must be moderated. Too much enthusiasm looks desperate. Too little suggests coldness. You aim for a careful warmth, smiling just enough, speaking kindly but not passionately. It's exhausting, this constant calibration. A second light joke flickers, emotional volume knob set permanently to low. But it fades as you remind yourself how much is at stake. Social approval matters as much as personal feeling. Families observe, assess, and quietly judge potential matches. Compatibility isn't just about affection, it's about class, finances, and moral standing. Historians still argue whether love matches became more common during the Victorian era or whether practical considerations still dominated, but you can feel both forces tugging at you. Romance is permitted, but only within approved boundaries. Private moments are rare and treasured. A brief exchange of looks across a room. A shared joke that no one else hears. These become lifelines. You carry them with you, replaying them later in solitude. Desire here is quiet, patient, and persistent. It doesn't shout, it waits. As evening settles, you part politely, no dramatic farewells. Perhaps a letter will follow. Perhaps another walk. Another supervised conversation. You return home with thoughts swirling beneath a calm exterior. In bed, the rules loosen just enough for imagination to wander. You think about hands brushing, about words left unsaid, about what might be possible someday. Sleep comes slowly, wrapped in restraint. Even in dreams, courtship moves carefully, measured and watched. Still beneath all the rules, the feeling remains. Steady, hopeful, and quietly alive. Marriage arrives not with a rush of romance, but with a sense of gravity, like a door closing gently but firmly behind you. Once vows are spoken, your place in the Victorian social order becomes clearer, more fixed. Marriage here isn't just a personal milestone. It's a public declaration that ties families, finances, and reputations together. You feel the weight of it immediately, even as congratulations swirl politely around you. You learn that choosing a spouse is less about passion and more about suitability. Love is welcome, even encouraged, but only after practical concerns are satisfied. One mainstream historical fact anchors this reality: marriage in Victorian society often functioned as an economic and social contract, particularly among the middle and upper classes. Dowries, inheritances, and future prospects are discussed carefully, sometimes awkwardly, always seriously. You realize that affection alone won't pay the bills, or preserve respectability. Once married, your roles sharpen. Expectations become clearer and narrower. A husband is expected to provide, protect, and represent the family publicly. A wife is expected to manage the home, embody moral virtue, and support her husband's social standing. Historians still argue whether these roles were experienced as oppressive or simply understood as natural divisions of labor, but living inside them, you can feel how little flexibility there is. Deviation invites comment. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you observe married life around you. Many Victorian couples used separate bedrooms, especially among the middle and upper classes. This wasn't always about emotional distance. It was often linked to health beliefs and notions of propriety. Sharing a bed wasn't assumed to be constant or necessary. The idea challenges modern assumptions, and you quietly file it away as another reminder that intimacy here looks different. Marriage changes social interactions. Invitations now arrive addressed jointly. Your behavior reflects not just on you, but on your spouse. A misstep becomes shared embarrassment. One historical fact settles in: a wife's reputation is closely tied to her husband's respectability, and vice versa, though the consequences often fall harder on women. You feel the pressure to present a united, orderly front at all times. Emotional expression within marriage is moderated too. Public displays of affection are minimal. Holding hands in public can raise eyebrows. You learn to communicate care through small, private gestures. A look across a room, a shared routine, a quiet word at the end of the day. Historians still argue whether Victorian marriages were emotionally distant or simply emotionally private, but from your perspective, privacy feels central. Children quickly become part of the equation. Marriage is expected to lead to family, and fertility carries social significance. The absence of children invites speculation, sometimes sympathy, sometimes judgment. You notice how conversations drift gently but persistently toward this topic. A light joke flickers through your mind. Victorian small talk has an agenda, but you smile politely and redirect. Legal realities shape married life in stark ways. One mainstream historical fact grounds this: until late 19th century reforms, married women in Britain have limited legal rights to property or income. Their legal identity is largely absorbed into their husbands. You sense how this imbalance shapes everyday decisions, even when affection exists. Historians still argue how women navigated these constraints through quite influenced resilience or resignation, but the limits are real. Social events reinforce marital norms. Couples are expected to attend together, behave harmoniously, and avoid public disagreement. Conflict, if it exists, is hidden carefully. You become adept at smoothing over tension with polite smiles. A second light joke surfaces. This is conflict management at an Olympic level, but you keep your composure. As evening falls, married life settles into routine. The excitement of courtship gives way to steadiness, predictability. There's comfort in that, even if it feels confining at times. You prepare for bed, the house quiet around you, aware that marriage has anchored you firmly in the social world. Lying down, you reflect on how much has changed. The rules didn't disappear, they simply rearranged themselves. Sleep comes with a sense of permanence, a recognition that this contract, social, economic, emotional, is meant to last. Tomorrow you'll wake not just as yourself, but as part of a unit navigating respectability together. Life narrows in subtle ways now, especially if you move through the world as a woman. You feel it in the rooms you're expected to occupy, the conversations you're encouraged to lead, and the ambitions you're gently discouraged from voicing. Victorian society organizes itself around the idea of separate spheres, a concept so widely accepted that few bother to question it aloud. Men belong to the public world of work and politics, women belong to the private world of home and morality. You don't need a sign on the wall to know where you're supposed to be. The home becomes a kind of moral theater. You're expected to manage it flawlessly, not just as a physical space, but as a symbol. One mainstream historical fact anchors this expectation. Victorian ideology often described women as the angel in the house, responsible for creating a calm, virtuous refuge from the harshness of public life. Clean rooms, orderly schedules, and a pleasant atmosphere all reflect your character. A messy home isn't just inconvenient, it's a moral failing. Daily routines reinforce this role. You oversee meals, supervise servants if you have them, and ensure everything runs smoothly. Even without servants, the responsibility remains. You plan, organize, and anticipate needs, often without acknowledgement. Historians still argue whether this domestic authority gave women meaningful power or merely burdened them with unpaid labor, but from where you stand, it feels like both at once. You hold influence, but it's carefully contained. Education reflects these limits. Girls are often taught accomplishments, music, drawing, basic literacy, skills meant to make them pleasant companions rather than independent thinkers. Serious academic study is discouraged, sometimes outright denied. One historical fact settles in: universities in Britain largely exclude women for most of the Victorian era, with only limited access opening toward the end. You sense how curiosity must be folded inward, expressed cautiously, if at all. Public visibility is tightly managed. Being seen too often outside the home invites scrutiny. You choose outings carefully, always with a clear purpose. Shopping, visiting church, these are acceptable reasons to be in public. Loitering is not. A light joke drifts through your mind. This is like needing an errand excuse to exist, but you adjust your shawl and continue on, posture composed. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you observe advice manuals stacked on parlor tables. Many offer detailed instructions on how women should speak, walk, and even think. Some warn against excessive imagination, claiming it could damage health or morals. Yes, even daydreaming is suspect. You quietly tuck your more vivid thoughts away, saving them for moments alone. Marriage intensifies these expectations. Your identity becomes closely tied to your husband's. His success reflects your virtue, his failure, your inadequacy. One mainstream historical fact grounds this dynamic. Married women are expected to prioritize their husband's social standing above personal desires. Historians still argue how women negotiated this, through subtle persuasion, emotional labor, or quiet endurance. But the negotiation is constant. Yet within these confines, you notice moments of agency. Women host gatherings, manage social networks, and subtly influence opinions. A well-run household can elevate a family's status. You learn to wield politeness strategically, shaping outcomes without appearing to do so. A second light joke flickers. This is soft power with lace curtains, but it fades as you refocus. Not all women fit neatly into this model. Widows, single women, and those who must work occupy more ambiguous positions. They navigate a world that both needs and distrusts them. One historical fact settles in: governesses, for example, often live in social limbo. Educated yet dependent, respectable yet isolated. You sense the precariousness of life just outside the ideal. As evening approaches, the house grows quiet. You review the day's tasks, mentally noting what went well and what could improve. There's satisfaction in order, but also fatigue. The sphere you inhabit is small, but it's densely packed with expectation. Historians still argue whether women internalized these ideals or resisted them privately, but tonight, resistance feels like rest. You lie down, the domestic world fading into shadow. In sleep, the walls of the house soften, expanding just enough to breathe. Tomorrow, the roles will resume, polished and demanding. For now, you drift off, the quiet hum of responsibility easing into something almost peaceful. The world opens outward for you now, but only if you move through it as a man. The public sphere hums with expectation, competition, and constant comparison. You feel it the moment you step into the street with purpose, coat-buttoned, expression composed. Victorian masculinity isn't loud or boastful, it's controlled, steady, and relentlessly self-monitoring. Strength here isn't about muscles, it's about restraint. Work becomes the central pillar of identity. What you do, how reliably you do it, and how visibly committed you appear matters more than almost anything else. One mainstream historical fact anchors this pressure. During the Victorian era, paid employment increasingly defined male respectability, especially for the growing middle class. Providing for a household isn't just practical, it's moral. Failure at work threatens not only income, honor. You learn quickly that ambition is expected, but it must be expressed modestly. Open bragging is vulgar. Quiet progress noticed by the right people is ideal. You speak of your work with seriousness, never enthusiasm. Enjoying it too much might suggest obsession. Enjoying it too little suggests laziness. You strike a careful balance, nodding thoughtfully when others speak of their careers, offering polite agreement rather than competition. A light joke flickers. LinkedIn before LinkedIn, but you keep your face neutral. Emotional control is paramount. Anger, sadness, or fear are considered weaknesses if displayed openly. You feel them, of course, but you compress them into something manageable, something invisible. Historians still argue whether Victorian men truly believed in emotional suppression or simply learned to perform it convincingly. But from the inside, it feels like carrying a tightly sealed container everywhere you go. Public spaces reinforce this ideal. Offices, clubs, and meeting halls are designed for seriousness. Conversation is purposeful, often clipped. Leisure exists, but it's framed as restorative rather than indulgent. One historical fact settles in. Gentlemen's clubs become important social hubs in Victorian Britain, offering men spaces to network, read, and relax. Away from domestic responsibilities, you imagine the relief of sinking into a leather chair, surrounded by quiet agreement. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you observe these clubs more closely. Many explicitly ban discussion of politics or religion to avoid conflict. Even in male-only spaces, restraint rules. You sip a drink slowly, aware that drunkenness would undermine everything you're trying to project. Moderation, again, is the watchword. Masculinity also demands moral leadership. You're expected to set an example for your household, guiding behavior through calm authority. One mainstream historical fact grounds this: Victorian fathers were often seen as moral guides rather than emotional nurturers. You offer advice, structure, and discipline, keeping affection understated. Historians still argue how this distance affected family relationships, but you can sense how love becomes something shown through provision rather than words. Physical appearance plays a role here too. Cleanliness, neatness, and sobriety signal self-control. Fashion is less elaborate than for women, but just as meaningful. A well-fitted coat, polished boots, and tidy hair suggest reliability. A second light joke drifts through your mind. This is minimalism with consequences. But you straighten your cuffs anyway. Failure is deeply personal. Losing a job, falling into debt, or attracting scandal feels like a collapse of identity. There's little room for vulnerability. You notice how men avoid discussing setbacks, offering instead vague references to challenges or temporary difficulties. Historians still argue whether this silence fostered resilience or simply isolation, but from where you stand, it feels lonely. As evening approaches, you return home carrying the day's weight quietly. You don't unload it with words, you set it down with routines. Dinner, reading, a brief walk. The household relies on your steadiness, and you provide it even when it costs you rest. A third light joke flickers. Emotional bandwidth permanently capped, but it fades as you sit in silence. When night finally comes, the public performance pauses. Alone or nearly so, your shoulders drop just a little. You reflect on the expectations you carry and the narrow space allowed for deviation. Sleep arrives as a kind of mercy, softening the edges of duty. Tomorrow you'll step back into the public world, composed and contained, ready to perform masculinity once more with quiet precision. Children, you quickly realize, exist less for their own amusement and more as apprentices in the art of respectability. From the moment they can sit upright, they're taught to observe, imitate, and internalize rules that will govern their adult lives. Every gesture, every word, every expression becomes a subtle rehearsal for future conformity. You watch them closely, understanding that childhood here is a form of preparation rather than play. Obedience is the currency of childhood. You follow instructions promptly, answer questions politely, and accept correction without complaint. One mainstream historical fact anchors this discipline: Victorian schools and homes emphasize strict rules, often with corporal punishment to enforce them. You learn to anticipate expectations, to read cues, and to move carefully through daily life. Even small failures, crooked line in a drawing, a too loud laugh, can attract attention. Discipline, not spontaneity, shapes experience. Play exists, but it's carefully constrained. Outdoor games are permitted if safe and socially acceptable. Indoors, activities are often educational or morally instructive. Dolls, miniature furniture, or writing exercises are designed to teach skills and decorum simultaneously. Historians still argue whether these early restrictions stifled creativity or simply told useful habits, but from the inside, they feel like rules written into every moment. You might wish for a spontaneous scuffle, but even imagining it feels dangerous. School is a world of similar pressures. Uniforms, regimented schedules, and strict teachers enforce attention to detail. Public performance, recitations, penmanship, and adequate demonstrations becomes routine. You learn that even success must be expressed humbly, never ostentatiously. A light joke drifts into your thoughts. Victorian report cards with a side of existential anxiety, but it fades quickly as you focus on sitting straight. Family expectations add another layer. Parents monitor behavior constantly. You learn to internalize guidance, translating it into self-discipline. Praise is measured, often delayed, reinforcing the idea that accomplishment is a private virtue rather than public spectacle. One quirky tidbit surfaces: some Victorian families use reward charts, of sorts, marking progress toward obedience or moral behavior, a method oddly reminiscent of modern parenting apps. You imagine the irony, smiling briefly before returning to seriousness. Social lessons continue outside formal settings. Children are coached in conversation, gesture, and even facial expression. Smiling too much is frivolous, speaking too plainly is rude. A mainstream historical fact anchors this: Victorian etiquette manuals often include chapters specifically for children, detailing appropriate speech, posture, and table manners. Historians still debate how effective these manuals were in shaping behavior, but the pressure to conform is unmistakable. Gender divides childhood sharply. Boys are groomed for public competence, encouraged in math, science, and outdoor skill. Girls focus on domestic aptitude, music, and polite conversation. Deviations from these norms are noticed immediately. You sense how early these patterns set trajectories for adult roles. A second light joke surfaces. Miniature life scripts, all pre-approved, but you suppress it. Friendships among children are similarly constrained. Play is supervised or observed, ensuring propriety. Gossip circulates quietly, and reputations form fast. You quickly learn to navigate alliances, avoid embarrassment, and signal respectability even at a young age. Historians still argue whether peer pressure or parental instruction had a greater effect on socialization, but it's clear that both work in tandem. Physical discipline reinforces lessons. Spanking, corner time, or moral lectures remind you of the consequences of failure. Emotional regulation is instilled early. Public tantrums are unacceptable. You learn that fear of judgment is nearly as powerful as love or desire for reward. A third light joke flits. Victorian boot camp for toddlers, but you keep your expression neutral. By evening, the day's lessons settle in your mind. You review missteps and successes alike, internalizing patterns that will guide adulthood. Sleep is a reward, a brief respite from observation and correction. Dreams might allow a bit of freedom, running too fast, laughing too loudly, or imagining unapproved adventures. But even in slumber, rules linger at the edges, waiting to resume with sunrise. The workplace introduces another layer of observation, another arena where every gesture matters. You enter offices, shops, or factories carrying not just your own reputation, but also the expectations of your family and social class. Hierarchies are clear and unyielding. One mainstream historical fact grounds this: the Victorian workplace is highly stratified, with managers, clerks, and laborers each expected to observe strict codes of conduct and deference. You move carefully, aware that even minor missteps, a misplaced document, a delayed greeting, could signal incompetence or poor breeding. You quickly learn that attire extends into the workplace. Men wear stiff collars and polished boots. Women dress modestly and neatly, often layered to avoid the appearance of casualness. Cleanliness here is a badge of seriousness. Historians still argue whether these appearances were more about morality or social signaling, but from your perspective, they're survival tools. A light joke crosses your mind. Office dress codes remain stressful across centuries, but you adjust your cuffs anyway. Manners govern interactions. Subordinates defer to superiors with polite acknowledgement. Superiors project authority without overt intimidation. Conversation is purposeful, measured, and often indirect. Humor is permissible only in very controlled doses. One quirky tidbit surfaces: some Victorian offices even enforced seating arrangements, dictating where each worker could sit to maintain order and discipline. You glance at your desk, noting its strategic position, and realize even furniture participates in social control. Routine dominance. Punctuality is moral, efficiency is virtuous, and visible diligence demonstrates worth. A clerk's worth isn't measured by creativity alone, but by adherence to procedure. One mainstream historical fact: the expansion of clerical work in Victorian Britain leads to the rise of office manuals, formalized procedures, and meticulous record-keeping. You follow each step with care, aware that deviation could be interpreted as laziness or incompetence. Historians still argue whether these systems enhance productivity or simply deepen monotony, but from where you sit, monotony feels accurate. Women navigate the workplace differently. Those who must work, often due to economic necessity, balance propriety with survival. You notice that attire, speech, and demeanor must remain impeccable. A second light joke drifts. Imagine performance reviews including moral character, but you continue silently, noting that respectability is always on trial. Social interactions here are subtly competitive. You learn to read micro-expressions, anticipate reactions, and maintain a polite edge. Flattery is strategic, opinion is measured. Gossip circulates quietly, and reputation can be affected by what is said in whispers. Historians still argue whether this constant observation improved civility or fostered anxiety, but it is undeniably pervasive. Physical spaces themselves enforce hierarchy. Offices are divided by rank, with more private or comfortable rooms reserved for higher status individuals. Factories segregate workers by skill and pay grade, often reinforcing feelings of order or subordination. You sense how architecture silently communicates expectation and control, shaping behavior without a word. Rules extend to leisure at work too. Tea breaks are timed and socially managed. Jokes are polite, topics circumscribed. You notice colleagues navigating invisible boundaries with precision, each action reinforcing or challenging the hierarchy. A third light joke surfaces. You imagine mandatory etiquette training even for water cooler chat, but it fades as you sip your tea carefully, avoiding overindulgence. Even mistakes are codified. Minor errors are corrected quietly. Major failures invite public scrutiny or reprimand. You internalize the standards, performing self-surveillance constantly. Emotional restraint, combined with meticulous attention to procedure, becomes your shield. One slip could ripple outward, affecting perception, opportunity, and long-term respectability. At day's end, you leave the office physically tired but mentally alert, aware of every small victory and failure. You replay interactions quietly, noting patterns and potential improvements. The workplace is another classroom in the broader curriculum of Victorian life. Discipline, innovation, and silent competition, themes repeated everywhere, whether at home, at church, or in society. Sleep, when it comes, is a welcome reprieve, though you dream in muted tones of rules and procedures, rehearsing yet another day of silent performance. Religion in the Victorian world isn't just a private affair, it's a constant, subtle observer of your behavior. You walk into church, the scent of candle wax and Polish mingling with the faint chill of morning air, and feel an almost physical weight of expectation. Faith here is intertwined with daily life, moral judgment, and social hierarchy. One mainstream historical fact anchors this: church attendance is a visible measure of respectability, with pews, sermons, and even clothing signaling status. You adjust your posture instinctively, aware that every glance and gesture is being noted. Sermons reinforce morality in both spiritual and practical terms. Charity, honesty, temperance, and self-control are extolled repeatedly, not just for your soul, but as markers of proper social behavior. Historians still argue whether these teachings genuinely shape belief or serve primarily as a form of social surveillance, but from where you sit, the lessons feel unavoidable. You listen carefully, nodding at the right moments, internalizing virtue as performance. A quirky tidbit surfaces as some Victorian churches used elaborate seating charts to maintain social hierarchy, ensuring that the wealthiest or most morally correct families were most visible. Where you sit communicates far more than you say. You feel both pride and anxiety as you settle in your designated spot, imagining the subtle calculations of others around you. Religion shapes behavior outside the church too. Sabbath observance governs work and leisure, eating habits, dress, and entertainment all carry moral weight. One mainstream historical fact: Sunday laws, enforced strictly in many towns, dictate business closures and acceptable public activities, demonstrating how faith intersects with civil regulation. You navigate your day carefully, aware that even private idleness can be interpreted as moral laxity. Morality is pervasive. Acts of kindness, honesty in business, and self-restraint are constantly evaluated. You feel that every gesture has meaning beyond itself. Historians still debate whether Victorians internalized this moral framework genuinely or merely performed it publicly, but from inside it, the distinction is often indistinguishable. Politeness, charity, and restraint all merge into a single, continuous performance. Charity, in particular, carries layered expectations. You are encouraged to help the less fortunate, but always in ways that maintain social hierarchy. Public generosity demonstrates virtue. Private neglect may indicate moral deficiency. A quirky detail emerges. Some charitable societies enforce precise rules about who may receive aid, how it is given, and even what words should accompany it, turning goodwill into a socially codified ritual. You imagine handing coins according to strict instruction, a light joke crossing your mind, but you follow the rules carefully. Religion also shapes gendered behavior. Women are expected to exemplify piety and domestic virtue. Men are moral leaders, guiding the household and upholding community standards. Historians still argue whether the system genuinely empowered women or confined them further, but the framework is unmistakable. Every action is a test, every interaction a demonstration. Even social gatherings are influenced by faith. Church festivals, lectures, and charity events provide structured opportunities to meet others and display propriety. Conversation is expected to reflect moral refinement, and jokes must be gentle. A second light joke drifts into your thoughts. Sex. Victorians would have a minor scandal over any off-color pun, but you smile privately, aware that humor survives best in shadow. As evening descends, you reflect on the subtle pervasiveness of religious influence. It is both comforting and confining, providing guidance while policing behavior. In bed, you feel the moral weight slowly dissolve, though traces remain, guiding dreams of well-behaved mornings and dutiful days. Even in rest, faith lingers at the edges, a gentle hum beneath consciousness, reminding you that life is watched, even when eyes are closed. Entertainment in Victorian society is a delicate balancing act between amusement and respectability. You quickly learn that leisure is never entirely free. It must signal taste, refinement, and moral uprightness. A walk in the park, a visit to a museum, or a concert is acceptable. Gambling, loud dancing, or unchaperoned socializing is dangerous. One mainstream historical fact anchors this: Victorian middle-class leisure often emphasized education, culture, and controlled social interaction. You move carefully, choosing activities that please both yourself and the invisible audience of societal judgment. Books and reading material carry weight beyond mere enjoyment. Novels, newspapers, and pamphlets are scrutinized for moral content. You avoid scandalous romances or political tracts that could compromise your reputation. Instead, you favor literature that elevates the mind or reinforces virtue. Historians still argue whether this reflected genuine taste or social pressure, but you feel the influence acutely. Even your private reading feels guided by expectation. A quirky tidbit surfaces: some families maintain library etiquette, where books must be handled with extreme care, dusted, and returned in order. Treating literature as sacred artifacts seems over the top, yet it subtly teaches responsibility and respect. You imagine modern e-readers facing the same reverence and chuckle quietly, aware that humor here must be silent. Music, too, is constrained by propriety. You play the piano or sing only in settings deemed acceptable, and only certain pieces are appropriate for display in the home. Loud, expressive, or overly emotional music is discouraged, as it could suggest a lack of self-control. One mainstream historical fact: middle-class homes often feature parlors with instruments for women's accomplishment, simultaneously showcasing talent and reinforcing domestic virtue. You notice how performance blends pride and pressure. The theater is another carefully navigated space. Attending a play can signify sophistication, but choices of venue, seating, and company are all significant. A second light joke flits into your mind: Victorian theater etiquette is essentially a social obstacle course, but you follow the rules diligently, knowing any misstep could provoke whispered judgment. Games are allowed, but they too have boundaries. Board games, card games, and parlor puzzles entertain without compromising propriety. Physical games are acceptable in private or with careful supervision. Historians still argue whether play was genuinely relaxing or merely another rehearsal in controlled behavior. But from your perspective, it's a form of careful experimentation with boundaries. Visits and social calls often double as entertainment. Afternoon teas, musical evenings, and charity events allow interaction, amusement, and subtle displays of skill or refinement. You learn to combine conversation, posture, and attentiveness into a single, fluid performance. Every gesture signals knowledge, taste, and moral awareness. A third light joke surfaces. Victorian fun is basically a live-action etiquette exam. But you smile discreetly, even humor is regulated. Jokes must be gentle, clever, and devoid of scandalous undertone. Laughing too loudly or at inappropriate moments risks criticism. You practice moderation, testing smiles and chuckles for safety before fully committing. Historians still argue whether Victorian humor was genuinely subtle or merely a survival mechanism in a surveillance-heavy culture, but your careful observation suggests it's both. The outdoors becomes another stage. Walks, carriage rides, and garden visits are structured, timed, and socially mediated. You avoid secluded spots that invite gossip, favoring routes that signal purpose and property. The exercise is physical, social, and moral simultaneously. A fourth light joke floats. Victorian exercise guidelines move elegantly or face social ruin, but you stay composed. As evening falls, entertainment merges seamlessly with instruction. Fun reinforces manners, teaches observation, and signals taste. Even private moments carry a sense of self-surveillance. You retire with the knowledge that leisure, like every other aspect of life, is another rehearsal in social performance. Sleep becomes a temporary relief, a brief suspension of the careful choreography that defines daily existence. Health is another arena where Victorian rules quietly tighten their grip. You notice it in the way people move, eat, and even breathe. Illness is never just a personal inconvenience. It reflects character, discipline, and morality. One mainstream historical fact anchors this: the Victorians believed strongly in personal hygiene, regular exercise, and moderation in diet as markers of both physical and moral health. You begin to view every cough, every lapse in cleanliness as more than a symptom. It's a potential social judgment. Dietary rules are strict. Meals are carefully balanced with vegetables, meats, and grains portioned according to social expectations. Overeating or indulgence signals weakness, while insufficient intake hints at fragility or affectation. You notice the quiet calculations that go into each serving. Historians still argue whether these rules genuinely improved health or were primarily moral posturing, but from your perspective, they shape daily life in unmistakable ways. You choose slowly, aware that every bite carries meaning. Exercise is similarly codified. Walking, cycling, or swimming is acceptable, but only when done in a controlled, polite manner. Running recklessly or showing overt excitement is frowned upon. Quirky tidbits surface as some Victorians advocated moral gymnastics. Exercise is designed to align posture, virtue, and social grace simultaneously. You imagine a workout class that corrects both your spine and your conscience and can't help but smile quietly. Medical practice is layered with both science and superstition. You consult physicians when necessary, but remedies often include strange mixtures of herbs, tonics, and sometimes peculiar practices. One mainstream historical fact: Victorian medicine mixes emerging scientific knowledge with traditional folk remedies, from herbal poultices to vinegar inhalations. Historians still debate how effective these treatments were, but their presence shapes everyday life. You follow prescriptions with care, mindful that compliance signals respectability. Cleanliness dominates domestic routines. You wash hands, face, and clothing meticulously, mindful of health and social perception. Bathing practices are surprisingly regimented. Frequency varies by class and belief. A second light joke drifts through your thoughts. Victorian hygiene manuals might have doubled as moral instruction, but you comply, knowing that neglect is both unhealthy and socially risky. Children are trained early in these habits. Hand washing, teeth brushing, and orderly sleeping routines are enforced as much for moral development as for hygiene. You observe the careful instructions given to small hands, noting how even minor lapses provoke gentle correction. Historians still argue whether these routines empowered children with lifelong habits or simply instilled anxiety, but either way, the discipline is effective. Illness carries social consequences. Being bedridden too often or failing to recover with proper composure invites concern and judgment. You learn to manage both sickness and appearance, presenting calm even when discomfort runs deep. A third light joke surfaces. Victorian sick days less about rest, more about reputation, but you suppress it, focusing on recovery rituals instead. Mental health is addressed cautiously, often through moral instruction and disciplined routine rather than therapy. Reflection, meditation, and controlled leisure are prescribed. Emotional excess is treated as a potential moral failing. One mainstream historical fact: Victorian psychiatry begins to emerge during the period, but its understanding remains rudimentary and heavily moralized. Historians still argue whether these alleviated suffering or exacerbated it, and you sense that both are true depending on circumstance. As evening descends, health practices merge into ritual. You prepare for bed with careful attention, aware that posture, sleep schedule, and calm thought signal self-discipline. Physical and moral well-being intertwine, reinforcing social and personal expectations. Sleep, when it comes, is restorative but quiet, never indulgent, allowing you to wake prepared for another day of meticulous attention to body, mind, and reputation. Religion, work, and etiquette all converge to shape your moral compass, but fashion, social norms, and self-presentation continue to dominate daily consciousness. You wake each morning acutely aware of how even minor choices, posture, clothing, speech, signal virtue or folly. One mainstream historical fact grounds this vigilancy. Victorian society emphasizes constant self-surveillance, expecting individuals to internalize rules so thoroughly that correction becomes largely unnecessary. You move through your day like a practiced actor, each step choreographed by invisible scripts. You notice how repetition reinforces these norms. Each day you dress with precision, attend social calls, and navigate workspaces and public spaces with the same careful movements. The body itself becomes a repository of habit. Historians still argue whether this internalization is genuine moral formation or simply social conditioning, but from where you stand, it feels both inevitable and exhausting. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you watch fellow citizens adjust gloves, collars, and hat sock. Some Victorians believed minor bodily corrections, like standing straighter or walking differently, could influence personality and moral strength. You try to imagine someone consciously training their posture to improve virtue, and can't help but smile, though subtly, for fear of appearing frivolous. The streets reinforce hierarchy. Sidewalks, carriage lanes, and shop entrances are patrolled by custom rather than law, and missteps, blocking a path, stepping incorrectly, invite disapproval. One historical fact anchors this: urban design in Victorian cities, combined with etiquette, produces subtle control over movement and interaction. Historians still debate how conscious this planning was, but the effect is clear. You move carefully, weighing each step. Conversations, both casual and formal, remain performances. Politeness is paramount and humor is carefully moderated. Jokes must be clever but safe, teasing without offending. A light joke flits through your mind. Modern social media might be a Victorian nightmare, but you smile discreetly, practicing restraint. Social capital accumulates in these small interactions, a silent ledger constantly balanced. Children are miniature practitioners of the same rules. You observe them mirroring adult gestures and language, rehearsing for their own social futures. Even their laughter is measured, their questions polite. One quirky tidbit surfaces: Victorian parents sometimes time play to reinforce routines, turning even amusement into structured preparation for adulthood. You notice the subtle skill in shaping compliance through delight. Manners at meals, once mechanical, have now become intuitive. You handle cutlery, respond to conversation, and gauge humor almost automatically as if trained reflexively. Historians still argue whether this unconscious performance signifies genuine refinement or relentless social pressure, but you experience it as both, a comfort and a constraint. Gendered expectations continue to operate invisibly. Women maintain domestic authority and moral vigilance, while men assert authority in public and provide financial and moral stability. Deviations invite scrutiny. One mainstream historical fact: legal and social norms reinforce these gender divisions, limiting women's property rights and men's emotional expression. You navigate these roles with care, aware that every gesture carries meaning. Even leisure is carefully calibrated. You visit parks, libraries, or cultural events with purpose. Unstructured edness feels wrong, almost suspect. Historians still debate whether Victorian leisure promotes creativity or merely enforces self-regulation, but the ritualized structure shapes your experience unmistakably. A second light joke drifts. Imagine being graded for enjoying a walk, but you comply, enjoying the quiet nonetheless. As evening falls, routines converge into ritual. Dinner, reading, and reflection guide you into calm preparation for sleep. You sense the invisible threads of social expectation in every choice, every habit, every breath. Lying down, the day's careful choreography dissolves slowly, replaced by a gentle hum of rules internalized yet softened by familiarity. Sleep arrives as both release and rehearsal, a bridge to tomorrow's meticulously orchestrated day. Fashion and appearance continue to dominate your consciousness, but now subtle variations signal more than mere taste. They mark social awareness, morality, and personal discipline. You wake and consider each layer of clothing not simply as protection or comfort, but as a statement: buttons aligned, collar stiff, shoes polished. One mainstream historical fact anchors this attention: Victorian clothing codes dictate precise norms for early, evening, and formal wear, and deviation marks you as unrefined or careless. You adjust your garments carefully, aware of unseen evaluators. You notice the hierarchy embedded in fabric and style. Wool indicates practicality, silk signifies status, and lace conveys refinement. But too much lace suggests vanity. Even color choices carry moral overtone, as somber tones suggest seriousness. Brighter hues hint at flirtation or frivolity. Historians still debate how consciously people interpreted these cues versus following rote instruction, but you feel the social pressure acutely. A small smile escapes at the thought. Choosing a scarf has never felt so moral. Accessories amplify your message. Gloves, hats, and jewelry are carefully coordinated, each item a symbol of refinement. Forgetting one or wearing it incorrectly signals ignorance. A quirky tidbit surfaces: some Victorian guides even recommend specific hat sizes or lengths for optimal social perception. You imagine a manual titled "How Your Glove Length Reveals Your Soul," and suppress a laugh. Movement itself becomes performative. Long skirts, stiff coats, and corsets or structured coats subtly constrain your motion, teaching discipline and modesty. Even walking or sitting is carefully choreographed. One mainstream historical fact grounds this: clothing and posture are intentionally interlinked in Victorian etiquette manuals to cultivate both propriety and social conformity. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious form of behavioral control or an incidental side effect of fashion, but you experience it as the former. Hygiene is inseparable from appearance. Daily brushing and careful grooming reflect both health and moral virtue. Neglect signals weakness or vice. A second light joke drifts. Victorian mornings are a 3-hour exercise in survival. but you comply with routine, feeling the paradoxical pleasure of ritual. Even leisure interacts with fashion. You dress for social visits, walks, and cultural events in ways that balance practicality with propriety. Observers measure your attention to detail as much as the event itself. You note the subtle glances exchanged as neighbors evaluate your coordination, a reminder that presentation extends beyond formal occasions. Historians still argue whether such scrutiny encouraged refinement or perpetuated anxiety, but from your perspective, it's both reassuring and exhausting. Children internalize these lessons early. Boys learn to walk and stand with controlled posture. Girls learn to handle dresses, gloves, and hair with care. These skills signal family respectability and moral instruction. A quirky detail emerges. Victorian girls often practice curtsies repeatedly until the gesture becomes second nature. You imagine a miniature army of tiny curtsying humans and suppress a grin, recognizing humor is always private. Physical discomfort is accepted as part of refinement. Tight corsets, stiff collars, and heavy skirts or coats enforce posture and behavior. You sigh but accept it as part of the social contract. One mainstream historical fact: upper and middle-class Victorians often endure discomfort in the name of appearance and respectability. Historians still argue whether these sacrifices were psychologically harmful or socially productive, but you experience both. As evening approaches, you shed layers slowly, each garment removed a small liberation. Yet even in relaxation, you maintain composure. Sleep does not excuse the habits of the day. Your reflection on mirrors or polished surfaces confirms alignment, posture, and tidiness, rehearsing perfection before rest. Sleep arrives as both reward and preparation, a gentle pause before another day of meticulous observation and performance. Travel in the Victorian era is never spontaneous, it's planned, purposeful, and layered with social expectation. Even a short carriage ride or a stroll to town carries implications about your status, intentions, and moral character. One mainstream historical fact grounds this transportation during the period: carriages, trains, and walking requires adherence to strict norms of behavior, dress, and timing. You step into your coach or onto the platform aware that your posture, manners, and attention are constantly under silent scrutiny. You notice that speed and route are coded. Arriving too early is eager, too late is careless. Historians still argue whether such precision truly improved social order or merely heightened anxiety, but from where you stand, the calculus of timing is unavoidable. You check your watch obsessively, making subtle adjustments to stride or carriage pace, ensuring that every moment conveys decorum. Conversations during travel are equally regulated. Public speech must remain polite and measured. Loud laughter or controversial commentary invites judgment. A light joke drifts through your thoughts. Imagine someone trying to sneak a TikTok on the train, but you adjust your voice, smiling softly while maintaining composure. Observing fellow passengers, you read subtle signals: the tilt of a hat, a flicker of the eyes, a shift in posture, all indicators of wealth, taste, or moral standing. Travel also dictates clothing choices. Sturdy, modest attire signals practicality, while fine fabric signals status. Weather, season, and terrain influence these decisions, and miscalculations reflect carelessness or ignorance. A quirky tidbit surfaces: some guidebooks suggest specific gloves for carriage travel to maintain cleanliness, style, and social appearance simultaneously. You pause, adjusting your gloves with precision, noting the odd blend of function and social signaling. Railways accelerate both mobility and scrutiny. Trains expose travelers to unfamiliar peers, creating microcosms of society. You notice the subtle hierarchies in seating, carriage allocation, and interaction. One mainstream historical fact: Victorian train travel formalizes class divisions, with separate carriages for different social strata. Historians still argue whether this separation reinforces class or simply responds to practical concerns, but you sense both pressures keenly. You select your seat carefully, aware of how proximity signals both respect and status. Etiquette extends to travel companions. Walking together, sitting across from one another, or sharing conversation requires calibration. Physical closeness is constrained, shared amusement is tempered. A second light joke surfaces: Victorian road trips like modern-day therapy, but with moral stakes. But you maintain composure, internalizing the rules. Children are observed closely during travel. Boys must sit and behave properly, girls must maintain composure and poise. Play is permitted only in controlled ways. You notice the subtle lessons taught during journeys, reinforcing manners, patience, and observation. Historians still debate whether these journeys encourage social adaptability or merely rehearsed obedience, but you feel the effect on both energy and character. Even the act of leaving home is a performance. Saying goodbye must be formal, clear, and courteous. Missteps signal disrespect or inattention. You practice these micro-rituals each time you depart, aware that neighbors, servants, and family are all assessing your manners, even in a fleeting moment. A third light joke drifts. You might call it etiquette boot camp on wheels, but you comply obediently. As day turns to evening, travel routines slow. Return journeys bring reflection, anticipation, and mental rehearsal for future trips. Each excursion, brief or extended, reinforces your understanding of social order, self-presentation, and moral propriety. At night, you lie in bed, recalling the carefully measured steps, words, and glances of the day, feeling the subtle exhaustion of constant performance. Sleep arrives softly, carrying you through the liminal space between observation and rehearsal. Communication, particularly letters, governs much of your social life. Spoken words vanish instantly, but written words endure, carrying your reputation, intentions, and emotional subtlety across time and space. You sit at a small writing desk, quill in hand, aware that every stroke, flourish, every carefully chosen word is scrutinized, if not by the recipient, then by the social conventions that dictate what can and cannot be expressed. One mainstream historical fact anchors this: letter writing is a central feature of Victorian society, serving as a medium for courtship, friendship, and familial obligation. You learn quickly that style is crucial. Formal greetings, measured phrases, and careful punctuation signal respectability and moral awareness. Historians still argue whether the formalized language reflects genuine sentiment or a rigid social performance, but you sense both elements working in tandem. A light joke flits into your mind. Victorian email would require 3 hours to compose one sentence, but you carefully draft your lines aware of the stakes. Content is heavily circumscribed. Letters may discuss family health or recent events. Personal desire is implied, not declared. Overly intimate language risks scandal. Under communication risks coldness or neglect. You fold the paper meticulously, knowing that the physical presentation communicates as much as the text. A quirky tidbit surfaces: folding techniques, such as diagonals, corners tucked precisely, carry subtle messages of affection, formality, or urgency. You practice the art carefully, imagining the invisible code behind each crease. Mail delivery itself is a social ritual. Letters are addressed, sealed, and sent with attention to timing. Receiving mail is an event. You handle letters with care, noting handwriting, stamps, and postmarks as signals of the sender's status, intention, and attention to propriety. One mainstream historical fact: postal services expand dramatically during the Victorian era, allowing frequent correspondence and reinforcing social networks across distance. Historians still argue whether increased mail contact strengthened genuine connection or merely amplified social surveillance, but from your perspective, both occur simultaneously. Letters guide courtship. Affection, admiration, and interest must be expressed subtly, leaving room for discretion. Women and men adhere to similar codes, though women often face stricter scrutiny. You notice the careful balance between warmth and reserve, knowing that misjudgment could lead to gossip or social censure. A second light joke emerges. Victorian texting would be a month-long negotiation, but you focus on the craft, enjoying the quiet intimacy of communication. Business correspondence follows similar patterns. Clarity, formality, and polite phrasing are paramount. One misplaced word can signal incompetence or disrespect. You sense how language itself becomes a tool of reputation management. Historians still debate whether this rigidity enhanced efficiency or fostered anxiety, but you experience it as both: a protective framework and a subtle burden. Even trivial notes carry meaning. Invitations, thank you cards, and notices of illness or sympathy follow conventions that must be observed scrupulously. The social power of a small piece of paper surprises you. It can cement alliances, signal favor, or mark exclusion. You handle each with deliberate care, aware that your social network depends on precision. A third light joke drifts. You might call this Victorian DMs, but you smile quietly, appreciating the ritual's charm. Even daily communication extends to verbal nuance. When reading a letter aloud or delivering a message, tone, inflection, and timing all communicate social awareness. A word spoken too casually or too forcefully risks offense. You rehearse mentally, perfecting intonation as carefully as grammar. The constant attention required leaves you both tired and alert, refining social skill to a subtle art. By evening, letters accumulate into a tangible map of connection. Each envelope page, each crease tells a story of compliance, affection, or duty. You set aside your writing implements, reflecting on the invisible threads of obligation and intimacy woven by ink, paper, and etiquette. Sleep arrives with the faint rustle of correspondence in mind, a quiet companion to dreams of proper conduct and carefully managed affection. Entertainment expands subtly into the domestic sphere, creating microcosms of society where behavior, taste, and social awareness are constantly reinforced. You notice it in parlor games, musical evenings, and literary salons hosted within homes. One mainstream historical fact anchors this: middle and upper-class Victorians often cultivate structured home entertainments as venues for display, refinement, and social networking. You move carefully, aware that every gesture, laugh, posture, even applause, signals cultural literacy and moral standing. Music dominates many evenings. Playing the piano, singing, or listening to a chamber ensemble provides both amusement and moral training. You recognize the dual purpose: enjoyment is allowed, but not at the expense of propriety. Historians still argue whether these musical exercises encourage genuine artistic development or simply rehearsed social performance, but from where you sit, they achieve both simultaneously. A light joke surfaces. Victorian jam sessions are more rehearsal than fun, but you comply gracefully. Games and parlor activities teach subtle lessons in strategy, observation, and etiquette. Board games like chess or card games like whist cultivate patience, foresight, and decorum. You learn to suppress visible frustration, moderate triumph, and anticipate opponents' reactions. A quirky tidbit emerges: some families employ game masters to ensure rules are followed to the letter, transforming leisure into a carefully orchestrated social exercise. You appreciate the ingenuity even as you suppress a small laugh. Conversation, ever present, operates as entertainment, instruction, and social calibration. Discussions focus on literature, current events, and approved moral topics. Humor is permissible but subtle, often relying on wordplay or understated irony. One mainstream historical fact: Victorian etiquette manuals provide detailed guidance on conversation topics, tone, and acceptable interruptions, reinforcing social hierarchy and propriety. Historians still argue whether these guides genuinely improved civility or simply imposed anxiety, but you sense both outcomes. Children's participation in domestic entertainment follows strict boundaries. They perform, observe, or play under supervision, learning manners, timing, and socially acceptable amusement. A second light joke drifts. You imagine a Victorian toddler being graded on their curtsy and chess moves, but the rigor of early training becomes clear. Early socialization ensures a smoother transition into adult expectations. Even visiting neighbors and extended family becomes a stage for performance. Parlor etiquette dictates seating conversation and polite attention. Silence is important as speech, gestures as meaningful as words. You note the subtle signals of shift in posture, the careful selection of topics, and the measured display of knowledge. A quirky tidbit: some families' main observation corners, where hosts quietly monitor interactions, subtly adjusting seating or conversation to reinforce social norms. You imagine the small thrill of being watched with approval and apprehension simultaneously. Leisure also reinforces gender roles. Women may perform musically or craft needlework to display skill, virtue, and refinement. Men discuss literature, politics, or business matters to demonstrate intelligence, taste, and responsibility. Historians still argue whether these performances empowered participants or constrained them within rigid norms, but from your perspective, both outcomes are visible. Social competence and refinement are inseparable. Even humor is a tool for signaling propriety. Jokes must be clever and direct and safe. Laughter is moderated. You learn to appreciate what without excess, smiling discreetly rather than laughing aloud. A third light joke surfaces. Victorian stand-up comedy would be an endurance test, but you admire the subtlety of practiced restraint. As night falls, domestic entertainment winds down. You reflect on the skill, attention, and observation embedded in even the smallest amusements. Play is both lesson pleasure, reinforcing social order while providing quiet satisfaction. Sleep arrives gently, the echoes of music, conversation, and measured laughter softening into dreams of social mastery and refined repose. Morality and entertainment all converge into the practice of public ritual, which shapes much of your social life. You notice it in church attendance, ceremonial dinners, and holiday observances. One mainstream historical fact anchors this: Victorians embed ritual into both secular and sacred spaces, using repetition to reinforce moral behavior, social hierarchy, and respectability. You move through these ceremonies carefully, aware that each gesture, curtsy, bow, toast, or prayer, communicates understanding of the rules and adherence to social norms. You quickly learn the dual purpose of rituals: spiritual guidance and social surveillance. Public acts of piety, like attending services or participating in charity events, signal virtue. Simultaneously, failure to adhere perfectly invites gossip or moral judgment. Historians still argue whether these rituals genuinely shaped inner belief or primarily served social cohesion, but from your perspective, both functions operate simultaneously. A light joke flits through your mind. Victorian rituals might require choreographed checklists, but you adjust posture and expression anyway. A quirky tidbit surfaces saying some households maintain detailed ritual schedules, noting exact times for prayer, meals, walks, and family readings, treating the day almost like a clockwork of moral practice. You follow these routines, feeling a blend of security and confinement. Even minor deviation feels slightly scandalous, highlighting the subtle yet pervasive power of routine. Meals themselves are miniature ceremonies. Dining is about more than food. It's a display of refinement, attention, and respect for others. One mainstream historical fact: Victorian etiquette prescribes precise rules for table settings, seating arrangements, and conversation topics. Historians still debate whether these detailed practices facilitated social order or created unnecessary anxiety, but you experience both. Each fork placement and pause carries meaning. Visits to friends and family are similarly structured. You arrive on time, dress appropriately, greet all present with measured courtesy, and navigate conversation with discretion. Humor is allowed sparingly, always tempered with politeness. A second light joke surfaces. Victorian social calls like mini diplomatic missions, but you comply, enjoying subtle social signaling and the quiet thrill of being observed with approval. Seasonal holidays amplify the performative aspect. Christmas, Easter, and local festivals combine spiritual observance with social display. Gifts, decorations, and attendance all reflect taste, wealth, and moral sensibility. You notice the careful coordination required, aware that misjudging presentation could invite comment. A quirky tidbit: some families coordinate entire holiday menus and decor according to morality guides, blending culinary skill with virtue signaling. You admire the diligence while quietly chuckling at the precision. Children observe and participate in rituals, internalizing social norms from an early age. Boys learn proper greeting, posture, and table manners. Girls practice curtsies, polite speech, and domestic presentation. One mainstream historical fact: instruction in ritualized behavior begins early in Victorian households, ensuring children internalize social codes before reaching adolescence. Historians still argue whether this early training fosters confidence or anxiety, but you sense both impacts vividly. Public appearances, even outside home or church, function as ritualized proof of respectability. Walking in the park, riding in a carriage, or attending lectures requires careful posture, attire, and attention to others. You find yourself constantly calculating gestures and speech to maintain social harmony. A third light joke drifts. Victorian sidewalks, catwalks for moral performance, but you follow the invisible choreography dutifully. Even in private, rituals shape thought and movement. Evening prayers, reflection on daily conduct, and preparation for the next day reinforce morality, responsibility, and social awareness. Sleep arrives slowly, layered with ritualized calm, leaving you attuned to the continuous rhythm of Victorian life and the intricate dance of observation, propriety, and habit. Charity and social responsibility weave themselves into every facet of daily life. You quickly realize that giving is never purely altruistic. It's a careful performance that signals moral virtue and social awareness. One mainstream historical fact anchors the sun's Victorians view philanthropy as both a moral duty and a marker of social status, with organized charities and charitable events forming key parts of community life. You navigate donation lists, charity balls, and volunteer efforts with meticulous attention, aware that both generosity and display carry weight. You notice that charity is codified. Who receives aid, how it is delivered, and the tone of interaction all matter. Historians still argue whether Victorian charity genuinely improved lives or reinforced social hierarchies, but from your perspective, both are true. You carry coins, offer polite words, and record each action carefully, feeling the subtle moral tension in every gesture. A light joke drifts through your mind. Victorian giving a social performance with receipts, but you continue seriously. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some charitable societies maintain formal rules for thank you letters, outlining precise phrasing, envelope folding, and timing. The act of giving becomes intertwined with the act of being seen as virtuous. You follow these rules, smiling inwardly at the tiny rituals, aware of their importance to social perception. Parody intertwines with gender roles. Women often take charge of organizing events, suing items for the poor, or supervising education and care. Men may donate financially, attend official functions, or oversee public works. One mainstream historical fact: gendered expectations in philanthropy reinforce social hierarchies while allowing subtle influence within those roles. Historians still debate whether these avenues genuinely empower participants or simply reinforce the existing social order, but you see evidence of both. Even children are inducted into charity work. Small contributions, participation in drives, or observing adult acts of giving teach responsibility, empathy, and social literacy. You notice how this early exposure instills habits that align with property while fostering a sense of moral awareness. A second light joke surfaces. You imagine miniature philanthropists keeping ledgers, but it highlights skill building rather than absurdity. Public events related to charity combine entertainment, display, and moral instruction. Charity balls, concerts, or bazaars allow you to demonstrate taste, skill, and moral engagement simultaneously. You participate carefully, balancing enjoyment with the impression of virtue. Historians still argue whether the blending of social display and moral duty enhances sincerity or undermines it, but from where you stand, the dual purpose is clear. Documentation reinforces charity's social importance. Ledgers, announcements, and invitations preserve actions for observation by peers. Your participation is recorded or emulated. One quirky detail: some families maintain personal journals of charitable acts, noting both donations and reactions of recipients. You admire the diligence and subtle competitiveness while reflecting on how generosity and reputation intertwine. Even private acts of charity carry weight. Assisting neighbors, mentoring children, or sharing resources requires attention to propriety. Improper timing, tone, or visibility can undermine goodwill. You learn to calibrate generosity with discretion, balancing moral action and social perception. A third light joke drifts. You imagine charity Olympics, judged on grace and tact, but you comply thoughtfully. By nightfall, the moral rhythm of charity settles. You reflect on the delicate interplay between generosity, duty, and social expectation. Even in sleep, these lessons linger. Kindness is both personal and performative, a thread woven tightly into the fabric of daily life. The quiet satisfaction of contributing, tempered by awareness of scrutiny, follows you into dreams of measured virtue and careful action. Education stretches its long, meticulous hand over your life, shaping not just knowledge but character, manners, and ambition. You sit at a polished desk, cool poised, books stacked neatly, aware that learning is never purely intellectual. It's also moral, social, and performative. One mainstream historical fact anchors this: Victorian education emphasizes discipline, rote learning, and moral instruction alongside literacy and numeracy. You follow lessons closely, conscious that missteps signal both personal and familial failure. The curriculum is highly structured. You memorize passages, recite lessons aloud, and practice penmanship with obsessive care. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on memorization fostered intellectual growth or merely reinforced obedience, but from your perspective, both effects are visible. A light joke drifts. You imagine Victorian homework as endurance training for the soul, but you dutifully copy lines, savoring small victories of neatness. Gender shapes educational content sharply. Boys often study mathematics, science, and languages, preparing for public life and professional success. Girls focus on accomplishments, music, literature, and domestic skills aimed at refinement and social competence. One mainstream historical fact: access to higher education for women is largely limited until late Victorian reforms, reinforcing gendered pathways. Historians still debate whether these limitations fostered ingenuity and subtle rebellion or constrained potential, but you experience both in daily lessons. Teachers enforce not just knowledge but demeanor. You learn posture, politeness, and emotional restraint alongside algebra or grammar. A quirky tidbit surfaces: some schools employ strict, silent hours, or even minor whispers earn reprimand, teaching control of both mind and body. You suppress a grin, recalling your childhood attempts at small mischief, aware that discipline leaves lasting impressions. Assessment reinforces social calibration. Examinations, recitations, and public displays of learning measure intellect, composure, and conformity simultaneously. Mistakes are corrected privately or publicly, depending on perceived severity, reinforcing both instruction and surveillance. Historians still argue whether the system promoted fairness or social stratification, but the impact on your daily life is unmistakable. Every performance carries weight. Outside formal schooling, learning continues through conversation, reading, and observation. Social skills, manners, and moral reasoning are integral parts of informal education. A second light joke flits. Imagine homework assignments on how to laugh properly, but you practice moderation, recognizing its subtle utility. Observation teaches lessons that textbooks cannot, shaping awareness, taste, and conduct. Even leisure and play are educational. Games teach strategy, social rules, and patience. Music or arts refine skill and discipline. You notice how all activities, structured or casual, serve as instruction in both competence and propriety. One quirky detail, some Victorian families maintain lesson logs to track progress in both academics and behavior, blending intellectual, moral, and social oversight. You admire the meticulousness while enjoying the quiet satisfaction of measured achievement. Parental involvement is intense. You are guided, monitored, and corrected continually, learning to internalize rules and anticipate expectations. One mainstream historical fact: Victorian parents often blend affection with surveillance, teaching obedience as moral duty. Historians still debate whether this method fostered independent thought or conformity, but the duality is apparent in daily life. You feel the weight and comfort of these invisible hands shaping every action. As night falls, your studies conclude, but learning lingers. Lessons, practice, and reflection merge into the rhythm of daily life, shaping thought, behavior, and expectation. Sleep arrives quietly, carrying you into dreams where knowledge, decorum, and anticipation intertwine, preparing you for another day of meticulous performance in the world around you. Romance and courtship hover on the edges of daily life, subtle, regulated, and fraught with expectation. You notice the careful negotiation of attention, words, and gesture, each one weighed against propriety, reputation, and social hierarchy. One mainstream historical fact anchors this: Victorian courtship is highly formalized, often supervised with strict rules about proximity, conversation, and letter writing. You navigate these interactions with measured care, aware that any misstep could have lasting social consequences. You quickly learn that desire must be veiled, expressed indirectly, and tempered with restraint. Direct declarations are socially dangerous. Flirtation is acceptable only within subtle bounds. Historians still argue whether the suppression of emotion created genuine romantic tension or merely performance, but from your perspective, the effect is palpable. You smile slightly, aware of the unspoken rules guiding every glance and gesture. A quirky bit surfaces: some Victorian etiquette manuals suggest elaborate hand signals or carefully chosen phrases to convey interest without risking scandal. You imagine modern texting reduced to codebooks of subtle gestures and suppress a chuckle. Even as you adhere, the thrill of secret communication adds an undercurrent of private amusement. Public spaces are a theater for decorum. Walks in the park, shared church pew, or carriage rides require careful posture, measured conversation, and cautious eye contact. One mainstream historical fact: chaperones are often present to maintain propriety, particularly for young women, limiting unsupervised interaction. Historians still debate whether chaperoning promoted safety or reinforced gender inequality, but the restrictions shape behavior unmistakably. You sense the weight of every observer, real or imagined. Gifts, letters, and small tokens of attention become instruments of communication. Each must demonstrate thoughtfulness without overstepping bounds. Timing, presentation, and phrasing are crucial. A second light joke drifts. You picture Victorian Tindern by etiquette manuals, but you follow the careful script, noting the subtleties that govern intimacy. Children and adolescents observe early forms of courtship. You watch boys practice restraint and girls display modesty, each learning roles they will later perform as adults. One quirky tidbit: some schools hold formal drawing room exercises to teach conversational skills, poise, and gesture, blending education with rehearsal of social and romantic norms. You note the precision required and the subtle lessons encoded in play. Even family oversight influences romance. Parents scrutinize letters, gestures, and interactions to ensure alignment with status, morality, and suitability. You notice the invisible calculus of approval or disapproval influencing each choice, from clothing to conversation. Historians still debate whether parental control fostered cautious judgment or stifled autonomy, but from inside, both pressures are felt. Humor in courtship is tightly controlled. Witticism must be clever, subtle, and safe. Overindulgence risks misinterpretation. You learn to gauge responses carefully, measuring each smile, blush, or laugh. A third light joke surfaces. You imagine a Victorian stand-up comedian attempting flirtation, but restraint prevails, emphasizing subtly over spontaneity. By nightfall, thoughts of romance recede but linger. Each day's careful navigation of attention, gesture, and propriety forms a pattern, training perception, judgment, and self-control. You lay down, aware of the invisible web of social and emotional rules, your dreams gently illuminated by hints of affection, restraint, and measured longing, preparing for the next day's careful performance. Conflict and disagreement are tightly choreographed, often invisible but omnipresent. You quickly realize that open confrontation is socially dangerous. Even mild anger or impatience risks gossip, damaged reputation, or moral censure. One mainstream historical fact anchors these: Victorians value restraint and politeness so highly that disputes are often mediated indirectly through letters, intermediaries, or subtle social maneuvers. You navigate every disagreement cautiously, aware that perception often outweighs truth. You notice the subtle arts of negotiation and persuasion. Tone, gesture, and timing are critical. A raised eyebrow, a delayed reply, or a careful pause can communicate disapproval without overt confrontation. Historians still argue whether these conventions fostered social harmony or psychological tension, but you experience both acutely. A light joke drifts through your mind. You picture Victorian passive aggressiveness as a national sport, but you suppress it, maintaining careful composure. Quirky details appear in daily life. Some households keep conflict charts or written logs of disagreements to track resolution and social standing. You imagine recording every minor spat for posterity, realizing the absurdity yet appreciating the structure. The rules of conflict teach observation, patience, and strategic thinking, reinforcing the broader system of social control. Public confrontations are exceptionally rare. You learn to mediate tensions through conversation, subtle hints, and careful facilitation. One mainstream historical fact: Victorian courts, etiquette manuals, and social clubs emphasize indirect conflict resolution and avoidance of scandal. Historians still debate whether this prevented justice or merely concealed tensions, but you feel the subtle balance between caution and necessity in daily interactions. Even minor social infractions carry moral weight. Interruptions, missed curtsies, or casual rudeness are noted and sometimes corrected quietly. You learn to monitor yourself continuously, practicing patience, politeness, and silent observation. A second light joke surfaces. You imagine a Victorian leaderboard for polite behavior, but you integrate it into your mental rehearsal rather than laugh aloud. Children are trained early in managing conflict. You observe lessons in sharing, turn-taking, and polite refusal, all under careful supervision. These skills translate seamlessly into adult expectations, creating internalized mechanism for self-regulation. A quirky tidbitting: some schools organize role-play exercises specifically designed to teach tactful negotiation and moral reasoning. You note the long-term utility, even as you chuckle privately at the meticulousness. Family and community both serve as arenas for conflict management. Gossip, judgment, and subtle social sanctions ensure conformity. One mainstream historical fact: informal networks of observation enforce social norms more effectively than legal systems in many Victorian communities. Historians still argue whether this fosters moral integrity or oppressive surveillance, but you sense both pressures in every interaction. Even emotions themselves are policed. Anger, jealousy, or impatience must be tempered, expressed indirectly, or concealed entirely. You practice careful modulation of voice and expression, learning that social equilibrium depends as much on internal restraint as external decorum. A third light joke drifts. You imagine a Victorian emoji keyboard restricted polite emotions, but you smile subtly and remain composed. By evening, the day's conflicts, minor or major, dissolve into reflection. You recognize patterns of avoidance, mediation, and observation shaping daily life. Sleep arrives as relief, a quiet space where unresolved tensions dissipate, leaving lessons intact, patience and strategic subtlety embedded in dreams, ready to guide the next day's carefully orchestrated interactions. As your life in Victorian society continues, the interplay of rules, observation, and expectation becomes second nature. You wake and move through the day like a well-rehearsed performance, each gesture, word, and glance part of a vast, invisible choreography. One mainstream historical fact anchors this: Victorian social codes permeate every aspect of life, from family and education to leisure work and public presence. You follow these patterns instinctively, aware that social missteps could have consequences, even if subtle or delayed. You notice how repetition has internalized conformity. Rituals, etiquette, and moral instruction form a lattice of habits, shaping both thought and action. Historians still argue whether this fosters genuine character development or simply enforces compliance, but from your perspective, both seem true. You feel pride in mastery even as you recognize the constraints. A light joke flits. You might describe daily life as a polished dance rehearsal that never ends, but you continue gracefully. Every interaction carries nuance. Conversation, humor, and observation all operate as subtle tests of social competence. A raised eyebrow, or a careful phrase, or the timing of laughter communicates refinement and moral awareness. You constantly calibrate, weighing expression against expectation. A quirky tidbit surfaces: some Victorians maintained personal notebooks to track impressions of acquaintances, blending social observation with almost obsessive record keeping. You imagine yourself comparing notes, silently noting small victories and errors. Roles, familial, occupational, reinforce expectation. You watch how men navigate authority, women manage influence within domestic and public spheres, and children internalize guidance. One mainstream historical fact of Victorian law, property norms, and social conventions codify these roles rigidly, influencing opportunity and behavior. Historians still debate whether these frameworks constrain innovation or cultivated subtle forms of empowerment, but you sense both in daily navigation. Even leisure is structured. Walks, games, music, and reading are intertwined with instruction, decorum, and subtle moral signaling. You enjoy small pleasures while remaining mindful of propriety. Humor is carefully applied, taste is curated, and interactions are measured. A second light joke drifts. You imagine a Victorian amusement park ruled by etiquette monitors, but you smile quietly and continue. Observation remains constant. You notice the silent measurement of behavior in every setting: at church, at work, during social visits, or even while walking the streets. One mainstream historical fact: Victorians often internalize surveillance so thoroughly that self-policing becomes instinctive. Historians still argue whether this internalization is liberating or oppressive, but you feel both in equal measure. Awareness becomes skill and skill becomes habit. By nightfall, the cumulative lessons settle. Ritual, etiquette, morality, and observation converge into a rhythm that guides thought, movement, and expression. You lie down, reflecting on the intricate choreography of daily life, the subtle rewards of compliance, and the quiet thrill of mastery. A third light joke drifts. You might compare Victorian society to a continuous etiquette boot camp, but you let it fade, appreciating the structure rather than resisting it. Sleep arrives, a gentle surrender where rules, reflection, and rehearsal dissolve into dreams. You drift through imagined scenarios of conversation, gesture, and careful movement, rehearsing the delicate dance of society without conscious effort. The constant hum of expectation softens, and you feel the security of order, the warmth of accomplishment, and the faint amusement of a life meticulously performed yet quietly enjoyed. The day closes, and so does your journey through the intricacies of Victorian social life. The routines, the rituals, the constant awareness, all these threads combine into a steady pattern, threading through home, schoolwork, and public spaces. You feel the comforting precision of structure. Every gesture, every word, every step has its place, its purpose, and its audience. This order can feel restrictive, yet it also offers a strange security, a rhythm that guides thought and movement with subtle predictability. Even your rest carries traces of this pattern. Dreams are filled with rehearsals, polite conversations, measured laughter, precise gestures, but they are softened by the quiet intimacy of reflection. You understand the delicate balance between freedom and duty, amusement and instruction, individuality and conformity. Each night, you surrender to sleep not just for relief, but as a continuation of the ongoing education in propriety and self-awareness, a space where lessons and observation meld into gentle patterns of imagination. As your mind slows, you carry with you a sense of the Victorian world's meticulous elegance. Rules, expectations, and subtle social currents form a tapestry that guides daily life and precision. There is reassurance in knowing the choreography, even when the dance is invisible. You rest, cocooned in the rhythm of structure, discipline, and quiet mastery, letting the echoes of careful living drift into soft, restful dreams. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let the world of Victorian order lull you into calm. Let the layers of etiquette, ritual, and observation dissolve into a gentle hum at the edge of consciousness, carrying you slowly, safely into sleep. You are free within structure, at peace in practice, and ready to wake again refreshed and aware.